Hi, and welcome to Mother's Quest, a podcast for moms like me ready to live our own truly epic life. I'm Julie Neal, a life and leadership coach, community builder, writer, and mom to two high-energy boys who challenge me to grow into my best self. I'll be right there. Where was I? In the months leading up to a big milestone birthday, I decided it was time to stop sidelining my dreams and become the hero of my own journey. I knew I didn't want to do it alone, so I created this podcast to learn from other moms further ahead on their quest, so their words of wisdom and lessons learned could help light the way for mine. In truth, I created this podcast for myself, but I hope you'll come along with me and find some treasures of your own. Hello, and welcome to episode number 17 of the Mother's Quest podcast. Before we get started, I want to say a few words about the season finale. No doubt you've heard me talk about how I created this podcast for myself. But I've also known and hoped that in seeking out my own guides and sharing about my own experience, that you'll also be inspired and supported to live your epic life. For the finale of the season, I really want to feature the moments from the podcast that have touched you the most. So I invite and encourage you to visit mothersquest.com, where you can find an easy tool to leave a voice message. Share your name, favorite moment from the podcast, and the ways in which that moment has impacted you. The deadline for submissions will be March 31st, so please take a few minutes in the next week to think about your biggest takeaway from the season and share. While you're at the website, I also encourage you to sign up for the email list and the Facebook group so we can stay connected until season 2 begins in May. Before I share about this week's episode, I'm excited to introduce Claire Fry with this week's dedication. Claire is an amazing mom, voiceover artist, and she's become a friend to me and the podcast. Her book club, which I recently joined, is going to be key to fulfilling one of the challenges from this week's guest, to read more. Here's Claire.
First of all, thank you very much for asking, Julie. I am honored to be dedicating this episode to my mother, Jillian, who did not grow up with a background in the arts. Grew up in a large working class Cockney family, but developed this amazing passion for literature and theater and gave all of that to her children. And I feel like it's just like teaching your kids to ride a bike. It's a lifelong skill, and teaching children how to watch theater, teaching children how to appreciate books and poetry, whether or not they go on to work in that area or even end up liking it as adults. It really doesn't matter. It's just having that skill of appreciation. And now I am a devoted subscriber to the theater, and I run a book club, which Julie is a member of. And it's a lifelong passion for me. So it's something that we share, something that we can always talk about. But there is not a day that goes by that I am not so grateful to her for instilling that passion in her children and just making it part of the air that we breathe. So thank you, Mom. This episode is dedicated to you.
Thank you, Claire. A similar love for reading and education is a gift that this week's guest, acclaimed Margaret the First author Danielle Dutton, received from her mother. Danielle and I spent many family holidays together growing up because our mothers have been lifelong friends. It's been years, though, since I've spoken with Danielle, and it was such a joy to hear about the epic life she's living. Danielle is the author of 3 books, most recently the novel Margaret the First, based on the life of Margaret Cavendish, a 17th century Duchess who wrote and published poems, plays, and other works during a time when being a writer was not an option for most women. In addition to being an author herself, Danielle also co-founded with her husband the independent press called Dorothy, a publishing project. The press, Danielle shares, came from her own interest and desire to create more space for original works by female authors. And it was named for her great aunt, a librarian who drove a bookmobile through the backroads of Southern California delivering books to underserved desert communities. Born and raised in California, Danielle now lives in Missouri, where she teaches in the writing program at Washington University in St. Louis, and enjoys time with her 8-year-old son, who has become a prolific writer of books in his own right. Danielle and I talked about the small steps she took along the way in her life, from working in a bookstore in England to taking a writing class and then applying for her MFA on a whim that brought her to where she is today. She shares with honesty about how she's moved through depression and anxiety in her life, and how she's become a kinder person since becoming a mother to her son, who she says is her favorite person in the world. We also discuss the importance of daily practice, how Buddhist meditation has begun to transform the way she thinks about herself, helping her to go down the right roads in her thinking, and how the book she's authored came from a commitment to a mindset of patience and a practice of writing daily. I found Danielle to be totally delightful and was inspired by her honesty, her sincerity, and this way in which she comes across at the same time relatable and brilliant. I'm excited to explore the resources she shared in Buddhist meditation, and I hope you'll explore them too, and that you'll join me in following through on her challenge to read more, to read books we wouldn't normally read, and make time and space for a writing project of our own to emerge. I'm Julie Neal, and this is Mother's Quest. Danielle, welcome to the Mother's Quest podcast.
Thanks. Hi, Julie.
A long time since we've had a chance to have a conversation after spending so much time in our childhood together.
Yeah.
So I'm thrilled about this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for asking me.
So, Danielle, you and I have known each other our whole lives, really, because our mothers are close friends. So I do have some background about your childhood, but I'd also like to hear from your perspective as an adult now, a bit about your childhood and specifically how your mom has shaped who you are today.
Okay. I think that, I grew up, my parents got divorced when I was 2.5, and my brother and I lived always with our mom. And so I think that was really challenging for my mom and for us too. And I think that what I got from my mom was frankly exhausted a lot of the time. So I think about that a lot now that I'm a mom, like how different it is to have a partner. And also I have, in a way, a lot easier job. My mom was a special ed public school teacher. So, she was at work bright and early every day, staying long. She was exhausted. She was on her feet with little kids all day long, kids who had a lot of challenges. And she was just working really hard. And then she had to come home and there was no one else there to help with the grocery shopping or the cooking or the cleaning or anything. So, she was tired. And I remember at dinner, she would sometimes just stare out the window. And I have that very clear memory, and I feel like I have it so much easier now. I have a husband who I love very much and only one kid, and I am a college professor, which it's not that my job is easy, but it affords me a lot of time. Like I can manage my time in ways that I choose for the most part. So I think about that, like how hard she had to work all the time. And so I think I think my mom is incredibly strong. And so I grew up with that always. And my mom is just this really competent person. She had to sort of be like the dad and the mom in the house. Not that, I have a dad and I love my dad very much too, but, my mom would have to like figure out what was wrong with the sink, stuff that I just am like, Marty, about.
So in many ways, it sounds like you've shaped a life for yourself now that has allowed you to have a lot of the things that she didn't have as a mother raising children. And one of the things I've always appreciated about your mom and still experience now, reading some of her Facebook posts, is just what a articulate, passionate, well-read person she is. So I'm curious about that, how that has, set you on a path to being so articulate and doing the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you. My mom is kind of, your Facebook post, I'm thinking she's kind of ferocious. Yeah, she is.
That is a good word too.
Yeah. And she's always been like that, in, I think, good ways and bad ways, like she would admit, and I think that in terms of how articulate she is and what I took from that and how that shaped me in my life, I think one big thing was that there was never any question that the most important thing was education. in our lives. It was just unquestionable. I don't ever remember questioning it, And so school mattered, homework, you just did it. There was just no question about it. And of course, she was a school teacher for most of my life. She was a social worker before that. And so there was no question that you would go to college. There was just no question that you would try your hardest and that books mattered and that learning mattered. And I think that this also comes from being Jewish, that you read and you question and you take texts seriously. And so it's so hard to say what shapes you, or, it's hard to go back and articulate your own origin story.
Yeah.
But I feel like that must have had something to do with how I grew up. Although I didn't think I was smart at all growing up. I remember her telling me I was. I thought I was dumb and I was very shy and I had a hard time speaking in class. And I didn't take school I liked school, but I didn't take it that seriously until college. Really. So I knew it mattered, and I never questioned it, or I never disrespected it. I just didn't really believe in myself somehow until a little later on.
Ooh, well, I want to definitely hear about that moment. Let's start to shift. You've been following along with my journey a little bit, and I shared with you before asking you to come on the podcast. But I basically, since the spring of last year, have been living what I call my epic life. And you could probably appreciate this because of your love of literature. But I got to a point, I was living a very meaningful, fulfilling life, very much focused on my children, but also doing important work and having, incredible connections in my life in terms of relationships. But I felt like there were always these whispers of things I wished I could do, or a picture of myself that seemed bigger. The self I was living in a daily way. And I think it was maybe something to do with this big milestone birthday I had in December. I want to hear, from my perspective, it seems to me like you are living an epic life. And it sounds like the picture of your life now is maybe not something that you always imagined would be the case. So what was the shift for you? What was the spark or the thing that started to move you on the path that you're on now?
Okay, but let's see. I don't think there was one shift. I think there were just shifts along the way. Being a kid was hard for me. And I think that we don't think enough about how being a kid can be hard for people, even if there's nothing wrong. Now, I've struggled with depression and anxiety as an adult and a teenager. And I think that now, looking back, it makes sense that being a kid would be hard for me because you don't have any control. You can't manage how your days are going. You're just sort of at everybody else's whim.
Right.
And so that led to power struggles between me and my mom. And that make a lot of sense to me now, when I think it was just hard for me to have other people telling me how my day should go, for example, which is just how it is being a kid,
Yeah.
But I try to think about that a lot with my kid too. Anyway, there was just shifts along the way, getting out of my small town. I grew up in a small town, and there was lots of stuff I loved there, lots of people I loved. And, but it was also, there wasn't an overwhelming sense of culture or intellectual engagement there that I could tap into. And this was before the internet. So it was a very sheltered sort of upbringing in a certain way, although less sheltered than some, because my mom was from New York City and my dad was from LA, and I was Jewish, which made me so different. My brother and I were often the only Jewish kids in our school, and we encountered anti-Semitism, and it was just a weird place, but I had nothing else really to weigh it against. And so when I went away to Santa Cruz for college, I suddenly realized, on the one hand, how unprepared I was, how it felt to me in class that everyone knew more than I knew. But I also could see that I was smart for the first time. I could see in discussions with professors that they would turn to me. I don't know, just those subtle clues you get that you are onto something, I guess. And so that was when I started to think, I might be smart. And I started to think, I'm going to go to grad school. I was a history major and I really loved it. And I didn't go to grad school. I don't mean to tell you my whole life story, but I'm trying to get to one important shift. I actually got engaged when I was in college to an English man who was about 10 years older than me. And I moved to England after college.
Oh my God, this is all coming back to me. I had forgotten about this.
Yeah. And I lived there. I worked in a bookstore for about a year, and it didn't work out. Well, also my visa was done. I had to leave no matter what. But we both sort of agreed I wasn't going to come back. It was very painful and weird, and I didn't know what to do. I was sort of lost for a little while. And then I kind of on a whim moved to Los Angeles to live with a friend, funnily enough, another daughter of one of my mom's oldest friends. And had this really weird 3 years or 3 or 4 years in Los Angeles where I was working in music management and I don't know, going out dancing a lot, and I was having a lot of fun. But this friend, her name's Megan, she decided she was going to learn graphic design, and she went to the UCLA Extension, and she just was going to take a class. And she was like, take a class. And I don't know why, but I chose to take a writing class, and I had never thought of myself as a writer before. And so I took this fiction writing class, and then that was probably the shift that started to turn my life in a direction that I wouldn't have anticipated.
Wow.
But I had no direction at that point anyway. I was just sort of like being young and having fun in Los Angeles.
I'm curious about the impact of working in the bookstore.
Well, something weird did happen there, which was, so all of my favorite books growing up were, like Jane Eyre, and I loved all of Jane Austen's and all the classics that you read in high school. And then for history, I was a history major, but I studied medieval history. And so when I worked at the bookstore, I worked in the history section upstairs, but I would walk through the whole bookstore, and there's what I now know is called the front list table. It's where new books are put out.
Mm-hmm.
And I just remember I would walk around and look at those new books and think, sort of, what are these? Like, I never engaged with contemporary literature at all. I sort of basically didn't know it existed. So it was when I was working at the bookstore that I started to read books by contemporary writers. And that was really interesting. That probably was the beginning of a shift that was happening for me. But you don't see shifts happening when they're happening.
I find that so fascinating. I often talk about it like all these seeds are getting planted and you don't realize what's growing.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that was when I started writing, when I was living in LA, and actually was having kind of like a hard time emotionally, and sort of decided I need to do something else. And so again, almost on a whim, I think about my own students now, they seem so together. And I feel like I was just sort of like stumbling through things like, I'll move to England, I'll move to LA, like I'll take a writing class. And then I think I had like 2 stories that I'd ever written, and I thought, I'll apply to an MFA program. And I did that, and I moved to Chicago. And so moving to Chicago was like, now my life is different. And I can see a clear trajectory from Chicago onward. And I did an MFA at the School of the Art Institute there, and that was really illuminating and probably, really fundamentally changed what I was going to do and who I was. So that's a very obvious shift. But yeah, there were these little seeds along the way.
And, let's start to move into, I love hearing the story, and now being able to see how all the dots connected for you from things I remember happening in your life, but see it in a different way. When I say that I want to live my epic life, it does connote this idea of what kind of story I want to live. And also, EPIC is an acronym mnemonic for the guideposts that I believe will help me live such a life, especially when I'm raising my children. So I want to just jump into these guideposts and ask you how they're showing up in your life. So the first one, E, stands for engaged, and it's about being engaged mindfully with your children. So tell me a little bit about your son and the ways in which you engage with him.
Well, he's amazing. He's 8, and he's my favorite person I ever met. I think about like the first second I saw him, not to be like too intimate, but they lift him up, and there's been this person living inside of you for months. It's just the craziest thing, like sharing your body with another person, and then they lift them up and you see their face. And I just instantly, when I saw his face, was like, yes, like I didn't know until right now that I was waiting for you this whole time.
I'm totally tearing up over here.
I just love him so much. Yeah. And it's such a silly thing. Like we weren't trying. I wasn't sure I wanted to have kids. I wasn't sure I would be a good mom. And I'm so glad that it happened, and it's really taught me so much and made me so much of a better person than I think I ever could have been without becoming a mom.
And what are the biggest things it's taught you?
Just to stop thinking about myself so much was such a huge thing, especially if you do struggle with like depression or anxiety. You can get sort of trapped, feeling bad, and it really helped me to come out of myself. So there's that. But I think I just feel like I'm so much kinder and more interested in other people. And I'm sure this has to do with other things too. It's not just because I became a mother, but it's definitely tied into that. I never particularly liked kids before I became a mom, which was part of why I thought, I don't know if I'll be a good mom.
Right.
I was not a good babysitter. Other kids never took to me, or like, you know what I mean? I was always that like awkward person with children. And it really was a learning curve. I mean, at first I was like, I don't know what to do, you know?
Right. As is true for most new moms.
I know. So yeah, I just think it's made me just so much more patient and more present and thoughtful. And I think it taught me too that, like, I don't know if you always know if you're a good person or not, you know? And that's something I mean, I wasn't like a terrible person, but I think being a mom, and I think I'm a good mom, has made me believe more in my own goodness somehow.
Yes.
And I think that the more you believe in your own goodness, the better you are able to be good in the world. And so I think that was really important to me too.
I love that. I connect to that too. Just feeling like there's something about it that brings out the best in you.
And the worst at times too.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
There are ways in which I can be, I don't think I ever really felt angry until I became a mom.
Yeah.
It heightens all of your emotions, the full range of it.
That's so sweet. I can totally believe that about you. I absolutely felt angry a lot of the time before I became a mom. I mean, I'm much less angry now, but the first few years of having him, I mean, it was this, sort of intoxicating, but like also almost hallucinatory combination of feeling like more in love and alive than I'd ever felt, and more like depressed and freaked out than I'd ever felt, because he was a terrible sleeper. And I think I was underestimating the extent to which sleep deprivation was affecting my own psychology, basically. And I felt, that period of my life was somewhat isolated too. So I was just sort of a new mom, no family around. I didn't have that many friends. We lived in a small town in Illinois. You know what I mean? I was just like going nuts, and it was really hard. I sometimes did feel really angry.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure how to be a mom yet, but we've come through it.
So tell me now, I love that he's your favorite person. What do the two of you do together, and how do you enjoy connecting with him?
Yeah. What do we do together? I mean, we talk, he is incredibly bright, and he talked really early. I remember my mom saying, like, you can't reason with a baby. And I was like, I'm pretty sure I can. And he's just always been really smart and articulate himself. And so we talk, and he tells me jokes, and he never stops drawing or making books, or he's just hilarious. He says the funniest things. Just last night, he does not have the best table manners in the world. And we were eating lasagna, and he wound up with, like, of course, tomato sauce all over his shirt. So I was like, give me your shirt. I'm going to put water on it. And he was just wiggling and running all over and being a little boy. And I finally got the shirt off him, and I said, go upstairs, get a shirt. Cause we were going to go out for a walk, and put a shirt on. And I was like, what are you doing? And he said, Mom, now you know my secret. Underneath my shirt, I'm always dancing. It was just this little throw off comment that he made. But I just like little bizarre things like that just fill me with such gladness. It's such a funny thing to say or think.
Just the humor and the perspective.
Yeah. Or even the fact that maybe underneath his shirt, he is always there. I don't know.
It's so expressive. It's so figurative. It seems like he's going to be a writer too.
Yeah, I don't know what he's going to be, but yeah, he's been writing little books. I mean, because my husband and I are both writers, and we're both college professors, and we also run a press together. And so we're always making books, and a lot of our friends are writers. And so to him, it's just always made, like, what people do is they write and they make books.
Right. So just naturally, that's what I would do.
Yeah. So since he was about 2, he's been making books. We would staple them, and we have these huge piles of books he's made that started out with just lines and then funny words. I mean, and he's just very funny. He's great. Yeah.
Oh, well, I look forward to someday seeing. Have you talked about publishing any of his books yet?
Oh, he always wants us to publish them for reals. Like, sometimes my husband gets them bound at this sort of copy center, and he feels really good about that. He's written one science fiction novel called
Oh my goodness.
Future of the Future. It's really great. Yeah.
So
I could gush about him all day, but I'll stop.
We could do a whole other episode and we'll just talk about this. Well, you actually started to connect to the next guidepost, which is P, and it's passionate and purposeful. And that's about making a difference that's beyond your family, beyond being a mother. Mm-hmm. You mentioned your press and that you're a professor and a writer. How would you describe the impact that you hope to have on the world?
Oh my gosh, I don't know. Such a big question. I mean, I don't know. It's just, this is a really hard, I would like to think that I help people, or that my students, for example, or that I somehow make someone's day a little bit nicer sometimes or something like that. And I really it's so much easier for me to think about how much I get out of running my press and how much I get out of being with my students and how, I really like my job and my colleagues and all of that.
Well, let's talk about, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, it all feels just very selfish, but it couldn't be. It's just so hard to conceptualize what effect you could be having, especially with what I do, because writing and editing is pretty much there's a way in which it's very behind the scenes. And then your book or the books you make go out into the world, and it's, even when you read reviews or things like that, it's hard to know always or to really get what effect they could be having.
Well, let's start with the press. First of all, can you say the name of it and how you came up with that name? And then I'm wondering, well, what was the inspiration for creating that? And what have you heard from the authors whose work you've helped bring to the world has been the impact of that for them?
Okay. Well, the press is called Dorothy, a publishing project. Dorothy, a publishing project. But everyone always just calls it Dorothy. And it was named for my great aunt, my dad's aunt, maternal aunt, Dorothy Traver was her name. And she was a librarian. She, on every birthday and at Christmas, she would send me a really nice edition of a children's book. And they were sort of stamped with an owl book plate that said, "To Danielle from Dorothy." And so our logo was an owl. And I think that in addition to, what we were talking about before about the sense I grew up that books and education was just of the ultimate importance, there was also this interesting sort of mysterious spinster aunt who would send me beautiful books, really beautiful editions of books. And so I think that there's another seed,
right.
Because from very early on, I began to appreciate a book as an object and to notice that some books were more beautiful than other books. And I've always been a reader. I never thought, until I took that fiction writing class, and actually much later than that, did I ever think of myself as a writer, or think that I might be a writer. But I've always been a reader, a pretty major, geeky reader. So it was named for Dorothy, Aunt Dorothy, and I started it in 2009. The first two books came out in 2010. And my husband's always been helping, we co-founded it. And then, and I guess the idea was, we publish two books together every fall, and it's a feminist press. And in a way we publish only books by women, but that's not 100% true. And I can explain that in a minute. But we publish two books together every fall, and we try to pair two books from different aesthetic traditions, because a large part of what we're interested in is the amazing diversity in literature, formal and stylistic diversity. And so we try to pair two books that we think are doing really interesting things, and together say something interesting about what fiction and what novels or stories could do or be. So we started in 2010. So this is our 7th year. And
what does it mean to have a feminist press?
Yeah. Well, it was sort of like a reparative or even utopian gesture in starting the press, because at the time I had been working at a different, really important independent press called Dalkey Archive Press for about 4 years as a book designer there. And this was after I finished my PhD, and I was still writing, but I was working full time at this press. And the press it's an amazing press, and I have tons of respect for it, but it does publish way more men than women. And I noticed that the submissions that we would get, whether they were from agents or just, writers sending in their work, were so overwhelmingly from men. And I just sort of, noted that. And then out in the culture, in the literary culture that I was a part of, it seemed like, it's not like there weren't women or there weren't women who got attention or anything like that. It just felt like the conversations were overwhelmingly by men or about men and their writing and their ideas. And so when I started thinking about starting a press of my own, I thought I wanted to create a space where women, it wasn't that we would only publish books by women. Our website, like our sort of line has always said that we're a press dedicated to publishing books of fiction, near fiction, or about fiction, mostly by women. And so it wasn't that I wanted to exclude men. I just wanted to make sure that women felt especially encouraged to send their work. And we're dedicated to publishing innovative fiction. So I wanted to create this space where on the one hand, women felt encouraged to send their work. And on the other hand, there was I wanted to create a kind of frame in the culture within which I would be sort of insisting through the books themselves that women write all sorts of things. This was a moment when people talked about chick lit a lot. And I really, really hate that term, or the idea that there's a way that women write, or there are particular things that women write about. And there's still this sort of built-in assumption that men's experiences are human experiences and women's experiences are women's experiences. And you see this sort of reiterated all over the place. And so I just wanted to insist that women write books that are as, strange and beguiling and brilliant and brave as any man's book might be, but that they're also about all sorts of things, and that they can be tremendously interesting and innovative. So that was the idea behind the press.
I find it just amazing. I'm so inspired.
Oh, good.
by what you've created. And so I'm wondering, what have you heard? It sounds like you didn't set out to make this major contribution in the world, but you just saw this need, and you saw something from your perspective that you felt was, frustrating or even a little annoying. And you're like, well, let me do something about this.
Yeah.
But what have you since found out? What have you since found out has been the impact of that?
Well, I mean, the press has done remarkably well and has become part of a larger national conversation about publishing and about literature. So, and I'm just really excited about that. And excited always for the books to get more attention and more readers. I guess the impact is easier for me to think of in terms of the writers themselves, having their books go out, having their books get reviewed. A few of our books have done really incredibly well. One in particular, Nell Zink's The Wall Creeper, sort of launched this woman, Nell Zink, to a sort of literary stardom really quickly.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing, actually. And so there's just this sort of very practical impact that Dorothy's managed to do well. And because of that, really interesting, innovative, brilliant women writers are sort of have this possible platform for becoming part of a larger cultural conversation, which is really cool. But I don't really take credit for that. It just sort of happened, and that's been really neat. I mean, the press, yes, I saw this need and I wanted to do something about it, but it was also selfish because I also was really lonely, and I was pregnant and then having my son. And I thought I was really isolated. I had finished my PhD, and, grad school is this really wonderful, heady experience where you were constantly in interaction with other people who were interested in the same things. And I felt like I need to have meaningful interactions with writers who I admire. And I thought if I started a press, that would happen. And it has happened. So it's also totally personal the whole time. Yeah. Even the feminist part of the press, I've had to learn how to talk about that because it was just sort of something I decided. There was this need in the culture. That was there, but there was also just a personal desire I had to work with women, mostly, not exclusively, but mostly. And I've worked with a number of male translators because we published translated fiction. It's not like I've only been working with women, but I wanted to make sure that happened too. And that was for so many personal reasons, from sexual harassment to just who some of my favorite writers are. And so it is it's so hard for me to separate out what was just my own personal inclination from everything else. Yeah.
Well, the next guidepost in E.P.I.C is I, which stands for invested in yourself. And I'd like to hear what what you have found has been important for you for taking care of yourself. And you mentioned depression and anxiety. Like what do you know? What have you learned?
Yeah.
Moves you through that. And I'd also like to hear a little bit about the experience of writing your incredibly acclaimed book, Margaret the First, and what you had to do to believe in and invest in yourself through that project.
Mm-hmm. Yes. In terms of taking care of myself, I have learned a lot. I feel like actually I've learned the most in the past 2 years. That's because I had a sort of nervous breakdown when I was 24. That was right when I was starting to write and I was living in LA, and it was pretty intense. And I started going to a therapist, and I learned how to deal with it, and I managed to sort of like stuff it away and to just sort of get through. And it had always happened, but I didn't really like to talk about it. And I don't know that I changed myself for the better in certain ways through therapy for sure. Became more honest with myself and other people, accepted that I needed a certain framework of routine that I had been resisting because I was a young person having fun and I didn't want to have to be like some, boring, whatever person in their socks who needs to go to bed early. But like, it turns out I'm a person in my socks who needs to go to bed early. And so I managed to get through and I was fine. I was doing well. And I managed to stop dating a series of, boyfriends who were not right for me. And I met my husband, who's an incredibly kind and caring person. And I was fine. But then 2 years ago, I was gearing up for my book to come out, myself to go up for tenure at my job and to turn 40 all at the same time.
Wow.
And I had another bout of really intense anxiety and depression. And I went back into therapy. But the big thing that happened was that I've started studying Buddhism and Buddhist meditation. And that has completely changed who I am. The changes are like really remarkable in such a short period of time. And so and this has been part of being a parent too. Like this is one of those other things, like they all are working together, make me a much more present and kinder person than I ever thought I was before, and ever felt before.
How does that show up in your daily life?
Well, I meditate every morning. I set the alarm to get up. And there are weeks when it doesn't happen every day, but I mostly do it. I'm constantly checking in with, just through books or, blogs with certain Buddhist teachers, reminding myself of things. And then just having to check in with myself a lot, it's really hard it was hard for me. And I think I imagine hard for lots of people to have to start talking to yourself constantly about how you feel. And I really hated that. So after this bout of anxiety and depression came back about 2 years ago, I was in therapy and I just felt like I'm so exhausted about having to like take my own emotional temperature like 100 times a day, or like constantly talking to myself like, no, that's not true. That's just a thought, And it seemed so stupid, and I hated doing it, like doing positive self-talk or something. It just felt like really self-helpy in a way that was not comfortable to me. And then my therapist pointed out that, really, you're always talking to yourself. It's just that we don't always notice it. And basically, I'd been being mean to myself for 40 years. And so I'm just not really thinking about it. And so to have to turn that around took like a huge amount of effort. And felt really unnatural for a long time until it stopped feeling unnatural. And so just like, but there is still this like sort of ever-present vigilance. Do you know what I mean? It's not, It's like a practice. It's not like, oh, now I'm fine and I'm happy all the time.
And so it was the practice of meditation that started to turn that around for you?
And reading about meditation and neuroplasticity and what it can do. And starting to believe that it wasn't just sort of like self-help craziness, but that it was like there was something real and profound that could happen, and that has happened for so many people before me, has been like really huge for me. So I need proof of things. Like my doctor asked me to start taking vitamin D, I wouldn't without a blood test. I was like, prove that I need to take vitamin C. So I needed like scientific evidence. And I feel like I've absolutely found that through a combination of, reading about Buddhism and neuroplasticity and cognitive behavioral therapy and stuff.
So two quick questions before we move on. Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit more about neuroplasticity and what you've learned about that? And I'm also wondering if you have a particular resource for us for learning more about Buddhism.
Yeah.
Meditation.
So I'm no expert, but just neuroplasticity basically is this idea that you can change your brain. That I've been being mean to myself for 40 years and had basically like carved all these pathways toward anxiety, in my brain. But I'm not forced now for the rest of my life to just keep going down those roads every day. I can start, and it takes effort. It doesn't happen overnight. And that's the thing that's hard about it, right? But you can start forging these pathways that are better roads for you to drive down, basically, where sometimes I still get on a bad road and I can feel anxiety in my body. It's not like it never happens. It's still there sometimes. And I think like, I have to actually think though, like, oh, back up. Like I got on the wrong road somehow and I need to get on the better road. And again, it doesn't happen in the snap of a finger, but it can happen within an hour now, as opposed to like taking a week, or a month or a year to get back on track. Knock on wood.
What a powerful analogy that is.
Oh, good. Buddhist teachers. Yeah. So there's someone I really like. There's so many people. I mean, I really like, I've found some people through Krista Tippett's On Being on NPR, which I think is a really lovely program. And she interviews, physicists and rabbis and the Dalai Lama. And but one of the teachers I've really liked, her name is Tara Brach, Brach. And if you go to her website, there's all these guided meditations that are free, although you can also donate to help support the community and the work that she's doing. And she has talks and interviews you can go to. And she is a trained clinical psychologist and a Buddhist teacher. And I think she's been very helpful to me. She's also an author and she has books. And then I really loved, there's a book called Happiness by a very intelligent Frenchman who is also a Buddhist monk who lives in Tibet and has for decades. And his name, I'm probably going to say his name wrong, but it's Mathieu Ricard.
Okay. I'll be able to link to all of these in the show notes.
And I've just found them really helpful. And I'm sort of doing it by myself. My husband totally can see the change in me and respects it all, but isn't interested. And I am working on mindfulness with my son. This is something we do together. He has Tourette's. And so I think mindfulness is going to be really important for him as he gets older, in learning how to, check in with what's happening in his body and his brain and figure out, how to calm himself down, basically. So
these are really great resources. And meditation is something that I've started doing more the last year or so. I think it has been a factor in me living my life differently. I do a morning practice. Every morning I actually sing the Moda Ani, which is a Jewish prayer. And a little bit of yoga, and then a few minutes of meditation. And the most I can ever get in, being the night owl I am, and therefore having the crazy mornings I do, is about 5 minutes. But I really want to grow the practice. I can see how powerful it is. So I'm going to check out these resources. And I hope.
I just want to say really fast. I think people try to do mindfulness and just sit down, and I think it's like deciding to just become a vegan overnight. I was also a vegan for 6 years, but it's like you need to ease into it. And so those guided meditations are like, I can now sit by myself and be fine for 20 minutes, but that took a really long time. And it's still not what I often use a guided meditation instead.
That's really helpful. So the last guidepost is C for connected to a strong support network. And the idea there is that you don't need to be on your own on your journey, that you can have people help light the way for you and be in community. Where are the places where you're finding your community?
Well, the really obvious one, the most obvious one is my husband and my son. Like, I really love being with them and they're both great. And then I also do find a lot of community through Dorothy. I have interns now, and an assistant editor who was an intern, and I do it with my husband too. And then the writers, I've become friends with a lot of the writers, and so there's that. And I love teaching. And I really love my colleagues where I teach at Washington University in St. Louis. And so there are those ways. And then I have friends, really close friends, but they're scattered all over the place. And so I don't get to see them as much as I would like to. And then of course there's my family, like my brother, my mom, my dad. So I have all those people in my life, but I also spend a lot of time alone. And that's partly by nature. And then it's also partly being a writer.
Yeah.
And I always wish that everybody I loved lived closer to me. I feel that I would be a much happier person. But then I also, as soon as I say that, can hear Tara Brach in my head saying that, you know, you have to be happy wherever you are. I mean, you don't have to, but you can be. So, yeah, I mean, I have communities all over the place, but, you know, most of life feels quiet and solitary, I think. And that's okay too.
I think an aha that I'm having hearing you talk, because often when I think about this guidepost, it's about being with people. Mm-hmm. And, you know, just actually thinking about part of your community connecting to the best part of yourself. Mm-hmm. And spending time with yourself. That hasn't occurred to me before, but I think
it can be hard too, but it's so important. I mean, for me, I mean, you read this in, you know, self-help books or all sorts of places that like you have to like love yourself. And it sounds corny. It sounds so corny, but I can see that once I was able to start, because when I first started meditating, for example, and they would say like, you know, offer yourself love, I'd be like, ha. And now I do that all the time. And I can see what made me start to switch over was when I could see how doing that for myself made me be nicer to other people. And, so yeah, I think it's really important to have like a community of yourself somehow. And to talk to yourself, be nice to yourself, keep that conversation, you know, out of the muck, because you're having a conversation with yourself all the time.
Right. Which road do you want to go down?
Right.
Which one's going to lead you to a better life and for you to show up in the life of the people you love in a better way?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, we're at the part where you get to offer me a challenge, but I realized that we didn't talk at all about your process of writing Margaret the First.
Right.
So
yeah.
Maybe I can connect this then.
Okay.
I have a desire to be a writer. Even just saying that out loud feels funny. So I've written all my life. I've always been a strong writer. And, you know, for years I was in fund development and I wrote grant proposals, even advocating for my son and writing emails, you know, and then more recently now I've done blog entries, blog posts. But when I went to do the opening for the podcast and I had to say a little bit about who I am, I consciously decided to say I'm a writer, even though I can have the negative self-talk of like, you've never written anything that's been published. So I'd love to hear, it was exciting to hear you say that that you weren't always a writer, or there were moments where it felt like a leap for you. Can you share a little bit about what it meant to step into writing Margaret the First, which has become so acclaimed, and then maybe tie that into a challenge for me that will help me on my path to becoming a writer?
Yeah, I can try. One thing I would say is that generally speaking, I think you sort of fall into a writing project. So it's hard for me to sort of sit down and think up one. Instead, I guess this would be sort of my challenge, would be to just write daily and just see what's actually already happening. So when I'm between projects and I sit and I think like, I'm going to write X, Y, Z, that never really works. It's more when I am just engaging in the act of writing and being like interested in what's happening around me or like what I'm reading about through my own writing that a project is born. So that's what happened with this. I mean, I will make this a very condensed version, but I first read about Margaret Cavendish in Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, and Woolf referred to her. I mean, that book is about finding a female canon in part, a feminist book. And she's looking through these older women writers, from past centuries, trying to decide like who was the first real woman writer, like a woman who was able to be a writer in the world. And Margaret Cavendish is one of the possibilities that she brings up. And she basically says, no, it wasn't her. She wasn't really the first. And she has these, particular criteria she's using. And, but she calls Margaret Cavendish, she describes her as a giant cucumber who's stretching through the garden and crushing all of the roses and carnations in her path. And I always remembered that because it's such a bizarre description of a human being. And it's also like weirdly phallic in a book about the female canon. So it's stuck in my head. And then about 2 years later, I was doing my PhD and I took a course with Scott Howard on, it was called like Poetics and Historiography in the 17th century. And we were looking at all of these different writers. And one of the writers we looked at was Margaret Cavendish. And I think she was like one of the only writers I'd never heard of. Except then at some point I realized she was the cucumber. Like it took to put that together. And I just became really interested in her. But I never thought I was going to write a book about her. I thought I was really interested being a history major in the 17th century. And I started this book, this totally bizarre book that was taking place in all these different gardens in the year 1660. It sounds really crazy now, but I worked on it for a couple of years. And it wasn't, and I finally had to just admit that I was most interested in Margaret Cavendish. She was one character in one garden that I was writing. And so it took me ages to get to the realization that I was writing basically a biographical novel about this person. I mean, it was just stages, all these stages of like shedding ideas and it becoming this thing that seemed so much simpler than what I'd been planning. But isn't really that straightforward and simple, it turns out anyway. But so it took me 10 years to write it, from when I very first started writing that book about the 17th century to when it was, done and being published. And that was when I was also doing my PhD and working full-time at a press, and I had my son and I started Dorothy, a publishing project. So I was not even then sure I was a real writer. I was doing all of these other things and writing when I could. And eventually, and then I applied for an academic job and I got it. And so that opened up the summers, and that's when I really started to finish the book. But it took like 4 summers.
And a 10-year process. Yeah,
in 10 years. And so I guess, you have to be patient, I think.
Yeah.
And I think finding the project through writing would be my advice. I don't know if that's really a challenge. I guess I would challenge you to read more books that are not necessarily what you generally read. So like maybe actively try to seek out translations, or actively try to read novels by women, or something that you're not, like try to look at what you're generally reading and read something else. And that will expand, the possibilities of what you yourself could be writing. If you want to write, I really think you have to be reading.
Yeah. Okay. So what I'm taking away from this challenge is, 1, a mindset of patience.
Mm-hmm.
2, to read regularly and things that are not always what I would typically read, and to write daily. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions about what that daily writing practice should look like.
I mean, I think that you have to be really flexible about it. Like I wrote so much of Margaret the First just, while my kid was napping, or, right. I mean, if you can write first thing in the morning, I think that's best, but that's impossible for most of us, especially with kids, but just to try to fit some time in every day where you're writing, I think is kind of huge. And so it's sort of, I'm not saying I always manage it, but it's kind of like honoring your practice. Again, it sounds sort of corny, but if you're not honoring something, like, it's, and this is hard for me. This is the struggle because I do so many different things that I'll go weeks without writing. And then I feel like I'm not, like it doesn't matter. Like I'm treating it like it doesn't matter. And so I know that I need to carve out, certain hours every week that are just for writing. And it's without pressure of like where it's going or what this is going to be, but just a period of time in which I'm just being a writer right now, even if it means I'm reading something or just sitting and thinking at my computer, but it's the time where I'm not doing anything else.
Yeah. Okay. Well, everything you're speaking to it's reminding me of all these whispers I have of things I I deep down know I want to do, but I'm not honoring it. I'm not honoring that instinct, that intuition. So,
well, good luck.
I love that these challenges give me some accountability. Would you be willing to be someone I could check in with about that?
Yeah, of course.
A little accountability partner?
Yeah, totally.
Great. Well, we're at the end of our conversation now, and this is when we close with acknowledgments, and I want to share a few of the things that I'm really taking away from this conversation, and then give you a chance to do the same. There's so much. First of all, I just have the sense of you just are really delightful.
Oh,
I don't know if that's an adjective that you often get, but there's something so refreshing about you, accessible, and then also so original and deep in all of the lessons that you've been sharing about your life and how you see motherhood and how you see the work that you do. I feel invigorated from the conversation. And the things that I'm taking away, one, just a reminder again about these seeds that are getting planted throughout our whole life. Thinking about your aunt sending you the books, and then you being in the bookstore, and then taking that class. And, we're looking back, you can see how it all connects. But as you're going through it, I'm having this appreciation for letting yourself kind of follow the flow of your life.
Yeah.
And just say yes in each of those moments without knowing necessarily where it's going to take you. I really appreciate hearing you talk about meditation and Buddhism and being more present and aware of what road you're going down in your thoughts as a way to not only deal with the possibility of depression or anxiety, but just to show up in your life and in your relationships in a better way. I definitely like this idea of self-love, not in a corny way, but in just a realizing how much, sometimes I have that experience where I'm like, wow, I'm with myself all the time.
Yeah, I know.
It's like when you try to think about how far the universe goes, where you're like, I can't ever escape myself. Yeah. So just appreciating, stepping into loving yourself and appreciating.
What else are you going to do?
Exactly. Appreciating your own thoughts and yourself and trying to cultivate it to be more positive. And then the last thing, God, I have so many. The last thing is about honoring your practice. Whatever it is that you think is bringing you what you want more of in your life, honoring it, making time for it. So much. I feel like I've packed a huge treasure chest today with all of
I mean, those are all good things for me to hear and think about too, and remind myself about. Yeah.
So what would you say is the biggest takeaway from this conversation for you?
Well, so mine's completely different. And it's hearing your voice. Because it sounds exactly like you, because it's your voice, but it's just thinking about you and your mom and your sisters and your voices. And I always loved you guys. You're, speaking of delightful, like such a delightful family, your dad too. And I love my family very much, but I always thought of you guys as sort of special, like this special family. And I think that your family is part of who I am as a mom too, somehow. The way families, can sort of, you know what I mean? Like influence you, even if they're not your own family. And so just thinking, just hearing all of you in your voice is really warm and nice for me.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I'm so glad that you said yes to this. And I hope there will be a part 2 somewhere down the road. And I look forward to staying more connected with you now.
Yeah. I'm excited to see where all of this takes you.
I will keep you posted. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Thank you so much for coming along with me on this episode of the Mother's Quest podcast. I hope this conversation sparked something that will help you live your epic life. If you'd like to get show notes and learn more about how to join the Mother's Quest community, head over to mothersquest.com. And while you're there, I would love it if you would follow the prompts to subscribe, leave a review on iTunes, and help us spread the word. I want to end with some words to light the way on your quest. Seize the day, love your people, honor your gifts. Until next time.